Being 28 and having to confront that truth more and more as 2021 comes to an end, I had a bit of a craving for something to distract me and bring me back to my happier days of youth. This nostalgic crisis was Power Rangers. Specifically, Louis Lovehog, aka Linkara from Atop the Fourth Wall's History of Power Rangers. I've been a fan of Linkara's for 10 years now, and I never cease to love rehearing the man's thoughts and recap of the best and worst that Power Rangers has had to offer. Overall, I highly recommend the series, as well as, doing what I usually do, which is catch up on Power Rangers every so often. But the real reason I bring this up is because, like many millennials, once you start going down into a spiraling hyperfixation, you end up finding some weird stuff. Chroma Squad. One of the weirdest and most anticipated games for me back in 2015, the year I actually graduated college. I know, I'm surprised too. An indie title that wanted to celebrate Super Sentai and Power Rangers with a grid-based Final Fantasy Tactics Askew RPG, where you essentially run your own Power Ranger series. The initial premise didn't really pull me in on its own. More so, I just loved the aspect of having an RPG game where you actually had to use teamwork and strategy to fight monsters, even if the initial premise was just, just people in costume and it wasn't real monsters. It was still fun to go into what essentially was going to be a parody with a lot of tongue-in-cheek references to both old cartoons and old TV shows that I used to watch, as well as just some good jokes referencing the struggles of what it was like probably to make Power Rangers, with budget cuts and having to go over limitations of scripts and whoever was owning the series at the time. Speaking of, Behold Studios almost didn't get to make this game because Saban at the time owned the rights to Power Rangers and were not happy with them doing this. However, they did manage to work something out, as they were simply referenced as inspired by Saban and probably some under-the-table dealings. And thus, we got a mostly very fun, very well-balanced, fantastic time capsule of a game. Gameplay-wise, Chroma Squad has a lot going for it, and in fact, I really want to jump into the details of that in a minute, but I feel like, frankly, to talk about Chroma Squad, you kind of have to come right out the gate and just say it. Yeah, this really is a time capsule. The references, the jokes, the parodies, the things that are discussed, some of this stuff was old even back in 2015. It's charming for someone like me who actually recognizes these references and knows what kind of craziness went on behind the scenes of Power Rangers as the years has gone on, and in fact can be enjoyed by anyone who even just knows the struggles of what a very limited budget can create for something. But then you get things like Not SpongeBob explaining the fun of sharing secrets, a reference to an episode of SpongeBob that is so old, I would be surprised if anyone under the age of 25 remembers this. Nowadays, if somebody picked this game up, I would probably expect someone to call this cringe, or straight up a poor attempt at nostalgia baiting, which is just bad faith criticism. It's very successful nostalgia baiting, but specifically targeted towards people like me, getting on into their 30s who actually grew up when Power Rangers was first airing, and thus a lot of references to shows and such at the time. This game is made and written for fans, by fans, and not much else in between. This gets even worse into the entire series when you find out that the monsters are real. The game goes from running a show to just plain out being Power Rangers, and while this was not exactly done in a way to not be expected very early on within the game, the transition to this attempt at being more serious doesn't entirely work. I mean, you essentially go from running a show to having to become heroes perceived by the collective consciousness of other people in society watching the show, thus making your spandex and all of your duct tape weapons real because other people see it as real.
What's with the spandex?
That is not spandex!
But look, the story gets kooky and honestly does not shy away from the fact that it's going to go this route, but that's just kind of the problem. It's not very executed well. There's a lot of good stuff and good framework here very early on, to the point where the lead hero of whoever you choose that person or color of the suit to be actually goes through a little mini arc through the midway point of the series. And there's an aspect of if you save or choose to accept help from certain members of a side team that can help lead the characters and the story down a slightly different path towards the end of the game, giving you, minor deviations from one another. But even still, by the end, the fatigue of some of the individual stories where they do try to be a little more interesting just starts to kind of grate on you. Each of the main cast goes through a mini arc where you're forced to just use their individual abilities and tactics based on their classes. Pretty much none of the characters get much depth beyond just the scout, the leader, the techie, the healer. Each story is strictly based on the archetype of the ranger, the class, and beyond that, nothing else is done. The scout has to learn that their ability to be so sneaky and so good at controlling their environment is not a detriment to their connection to their friends. The assault learns to not be as much of a meathead. The techie starts to accept that they need to dumb things down for their friends who are interested in their tech. They just have to bring it down to a certain language. It's fine, it's interesting, but you gotta keep in mind that these stories happen after 3 other seasons, multiple levels, multiple fights of just jokes and references that, again, I as an adult appreciate, but I don't think most kids nowadays are going to get or even understand, and most teenagers and younger adults are going to look at it and see as trite. These stories on paper are a lot of fun and a good use of the character class limitations and structure, and the fights themselves, which again I'll be explaining into, are great. But after going through the entire game relying on teamwork and not really wanting to take this game too seriously, it just seems half-baked, not half-assed. Just a sequel would definitely help this story take much deeper dives and take much more interesting concepts of what's going on. But for now, Chroma Squad really starts off as just fan wanking, jokes and references, and a really good combat style, and that's all it really should have stayed for a little bit. Speaking of the combat, it's grid-based battle system where certain abilities, both harmful and helpful, have limited range, varying cooldowns, and those abilities each getting scattered across multiple classes. Each class having its own specification, as I said before. The Scout's abilities consist more of going invisible and popping off special attacks that, if kill, allow the Scout to attack again, or even just simply stun abilities. Assault is all about big damage, whether striking multiple targets or just beefing themselves up to do stronger singular attacks, and even getting some innate abilities to yeet allies further distances away, or giving themselves some self-heal so that they can handle more damage and be a little bit more of a tanky bruiser. Tech is kind of an in-between Scout and Assault, having the range as their primary, but the ability to both damage and debuff several enemies at once. Often I would try to make the Techie the last to go into fights as the teamwork attack initiator or the distant surprise ender, when not trying to bail out any of my front lines for a swap out because of bad swarms or bad tactics on my part. And with the ability to teleport, Techie becomes more of a hit-and-run class than even the Scout, who is able to jump deep into a fight, control an enemy target, and then leave shortly after. Assist is pretty self-explanatory. Heals, got 'em. Debuffs off ya, got 'em. Range initiator for team attacks, got 'em. Unless you give assists the better weapons and gear provided during further seasons, don't expect this member of the team to be getting a lot of kills on their own. It's in the name. If you need another ranger to team up attack or to help keep the other rangers going or just to pop off that last little bit of range damage, that's when you use assist. But otherwise, they're all about healing, even just getting near their friends for a teamwork stance and healing them just by being close. Lastly, there's the leader, who is kind of the all-arounder of the party. Their stats are all around balanced, they have positional control both on enemies and for the party, they have defense boosts, a little bit of healing, a little bit of damage boosting. They are, as a far more successful man once said, a little bit of everything, all of the time. Their only major weakness is whether or not you give them ranged or melee weapons, but the game really leans you towards spears with this class, so range is just kind of not their forte, and from there there, as I've been hinting at, any of the Rangers can go into teamwork stances, allowing them to toss their comrades further than they can run, or party up for double, triple, quadruple, or even full-on team finishers, made even stronger if you manage to perk all the weapon attacks on the 5-man band strike. Now, you won't start with all the abilities save for the use of teamwork, weapons, and some stat perks. One of the benefits of this game is how masterfully it gets you used to the idea of getting ranger positionals and appropriately drawn aggro to and from other members of your team, or to just work together to take on a foe that they couldn't solo on their own. As you continue in the game and finish off season finales, more ability choices become available for each class, allowing you to pick and choose what abilities you want the crew to have and how each specialized ranger can learn into their powers. The specialization goes even further when you're buying and crafting gear for your rangers, trying to give them weapons and armor that can either cover their weaknesses or enhance what's already strong about them. Really, it comes down to what you want each class to play as, but I'm pretty partial to just picking abilities that boost the assets that these rangers already are great at, rather than trying to make everyone balanced. It can work, I've seen it work, and I even remember doing this when I was younger, but I've just become much more of a metagamer as I've gotten older. But I can assure you, if you want to just cover the weaknesses of all your rangers, you can do that and still win. Anything can work as long as you know what you're doing and you keep a core element of teamwork and squad attacks as your main source of kills, at least till you start unlocking multi-shots and more grid control abilities. This game does such a good job of making you feel so damn smart for finding the right focus, the right position, the right attacks, the right timing, especially for missions where you need to restart a fight simply because you didn't know enough or weren't thinking clearly enough. Many of the bosses down the season's path get very tricky with different abilities that spawn more enemies or cause large areas of healing and harming if not dealt with. Some fights are a little tedious and are more of a test of patience than strategy, which is the game's mechanical problem. These aren't really fun mechanics to me, and they just prolong the encounter by having you stop hitting the boss to deal with this minor annoyance that, if untreated, would just make you lose the fight. Especially during the end, the fights turn into a war of attrition. Your enjoyment of the mechanics and story versus the prolonged use of mechanics you've long figured out on how to deal with, but are limited to how much you can actually do anything about, becomes the real enemy. I know Major Whiplash, since I was just going on into detail about what's so great about the game, and again, most of the seasons, most of the episodes, most of the fights deal with just making sure that you have good teamwork going on, and you're going on with these director instructions that give you these bonuses to your audience level. And if the audience is happy, you get more money to get more gear and to be better rangers, both in and out of the show. In general, most of the fights are a lot of fun, and some of the bosses themselves have mechanics and strategies on how their AI works that makes the game enjoyable. But the truth is, as the game goes on, by the 3rd and 4th season, you start to have to deal with bosses who are just trying to keep from you getting even close to them. It's not hard, it's just frustrating because it feels like the mechanics could have been a little bit more interesting. But hey, that's a 10 to 15 hours of gameplay and prep time that you get to enjoy, with just the last couple of hours being a little more tedious than the rest. Oh, and you also get a Megazord. Your mech basically has a few functions that it can do, primarily doing punches that, based on your timing, create good or perfect hits, and just plain misses. That bar for contact shrinks the more you hit consecutively, so you need to juggle your timing and a bit of luck of how well you think you'll be able to land the next hit before you eventually have to either miss or choose to use this boosted energy for one of two choices. Either using a finisher attack or simply using this energy to shield yourself and prep for an oncoming strike. Really, the kaiju fights are more of a mini-game and a fun one and a nice cap off of the end of an episode or a season. Something that I don't think should be forgotten, but it's not the biggest selling point to the game. It's like trying to sell you a meal just on the side plate. It does complete the dish, but it's not the initial reason that you pitch it. Rather, it's an afterthought. But it's a fun one. So that's just been me rambling and going off about the ups and downs of Chroma Squad, the small-time little addiction I had when I wasn't playing Final Fantasy and wasn't writing scripts for other things. Personally, I think the game is still worth visiting today if you're a fan of the inspiration to the game and want to see something fans created because they just love Power Rangers and Super Sentai so much. However, there are some notes of improvement that I would like to go into detail about rather than just criticizing and not giving example. Mechanically, as I explained, there's not a lot that has to be done. The core essence of teamwork and multiple class abilities working together is pretty fucking fun. Like, it is almost addictive to just get your team together and use their abilities correctly and just figure out the puzzles that are the different fight maps. If you throw in any mechanics for bosses or environments, any of that's going to prolong a fight. But the problem comes down to throwing in mechanics that are simply made to prolong a fight. Mechanics to where you're just summoning more monsters or making the boss run away from the group, just making it to where they can't walk around or have to deal with some kind of bomb or diffusing method that just slows down the fight. That stuff is made only to make the fight longer, not to make the fight more fun. So how would I suggest doing something different? Personally, I think leaning more into the director challenges or even just having specific challenges for fight would make the entire experience more fun. There is a lot of good stuff like keeping your team above certain health or not morphing until a specific point in the fight. That's pretty fun because it adds some variety and kind of gives some flavor to each episode. Expanding on this and making mechanics that maybe separate Rangers more often and you need to bring them back together through clever understanding of the map and your character's abilities. Again, not unlike how the individual storylines went. More fights where bosses are invincible but less threatening until you meet requirements that make them very vulnerable and then they get far more aggressive. Stuff like this could make fights more interesting and not overstay their welcome. Mech fights, I don't think need to be changed all that much. Just give more interesting abilities and just have some cooler new animations. Shops and crafting, a tune-up would be kind of nice because while I know you can beat the game by just buying gear, I personally feel like you're really wasting potential by not crafting gear because you can get much better stats for your characters. So personally, I would just say have the shop be focused more on buying materials versus buying gear, so you can just primarily focus on the heart of the idea that the show is being created by a bunch of people who are slowly learning the intricacies of running a show, making props, trying to take care of things with a certain budget, not unlike Power Rangers. But the game doesn't really lean you towards one or the other, which I just think it's in a sequel or spiritual successor, they should just outright say or pick where the focus should be. Story is where I feel most of the improvements need to come from in a successor. Chroma Squad knew its audience and knew its premise would initially only reach that singular audience. Now that we're in this year of 2021, a lot more kookier, crazier, or less expected successes of games have come out, I honestly think that something like this would actually sell big time, especially if you focus on the story being a little bit more interesting than just tongue-in-cheek references. You don't have to cater to fanboys and fangirls anymore, just by pointing out that they're fans of something. Instead, actively make the thing that you fell in love with so much. Like, in the story, they do talk about a little bit about how the Rangers are real, but they're also still running a show. What if you went further with that? What if you went something like the Tiger and Bunny anime or My Hero Academia, where you have to discuss the juggling of fame and acclaim while wanting to live a bit of a normal life while also being a superhero? That would allow for a much deeper dive into character psyche and make it a much more character-driven show, just with the goofiness of Power Rangers, which Power Rangers has been able to do for a very long time, very successfully. Power Rangers RPM was a weird show and I loved it.
Red is the perfect one, black is the brooding bad boy, green is the clown, and yellow, well, she's the girl. So what are you supposed to be?
I'm Scottish!
I'd also make it where the player could still choose which ranger has what class and color, but maybe have a specific cast of characters who themselves have specific storylines to go through. Have more in-depth and expanded individual tales to play out during the mid and final segments of the game, maybe even sooner. Though I would say that saving the first third for class-oriented storylines, maybe in tutorials, or just to kind of get the characters started with their interesting quirks, could be actually a really good way of starting the show. I wouldn't have too many, like maybe a total of 7 or 8 characters you can choose for this 5-man team. That way there is reason to go back and play again. Maybe even add some DLC characters down the road, but essentially make the stories less about the classes and more about the characters. Again, the first Chroma Squad needed to cater to its market, and I understand why they did what they did. This kind of game was only ever going to really be sold to Power Ranger or Tokusatsu fans, and for the most part, they did a good job of catering to that. But with the second shot, I think a Chroma Squad-like game could tackle much heavier topics in much better ways while focusing on expanding the already very well-established gameplay. I mean, I made a joke earlier about Persona, but stealing some of the spirits behind social links and how juggling a second identity works, even if known, could make for some fun drama, the likes even the original show the game is based on might not have been able to pull off. What do you guys think? Have you played Chroma Squad before watching this video, and do you think I'm giving this game a fair shake, or am I looking back on my own nostalgia with a little bit too much disdain and I'm too old for this? Are you interested in playing the game if you've never tried it before? And if you have tried it before and just couldn't really get into it, why not? Let me know below and feel free to suggest other titles that you think are worth doing deep dives into, or if there's any games that you want to personally introduce me to that I might not have ever heard. This year especially, I'm learning just how vast the gaming space is for choices and how much gets buried without us, aka me, knowing about it. Thanks again for watching this video, and I hope to see you guys soon in another analysis in the future.